All right, friends, it's time to give you loyal listeners a discount on protein powder. You may or may not know, but I launched my very first protein powder 2 years ago. It's a grass-fed beef isolate with only 3 ingredients: grass-fed beef, either organic cacao or organic vanilla, and organic monk fruit. Now, if you don't want any of the added flavor and sweeteners, you can also just get unflavored. And no matter what flavor you choose, you're getting over 23 grams of protein per scoop, which is going to keep you full and satisfied between meals. I love starting my day with a Fab4 smoothie and breaking my fast with that much protein. It makes a serious difference in my cravings and blood sugar balance the rest of the day, and I've seen it with my clients as well. Now, I never thought I'd own a product company, but when I got pregnant with Sebastian, I realized the majority of protein powders were chemically extracted or enzymatically extracted, and I wanted to use heat and water only. I wanted minimal ingredients because we don't need those emulsifiers, fillers, or added vitamins, minerals, and probiotics. All of those additions increase the chances that it's not going to work for your body, whether it be bloating, digestion issues. I just wanted pure, clean protein to keep you full and satisfied so you could build the most delicious Fab4 smoothie. And I have to say, I'm pretty proud of the flavor. If you take a look at our reviews on Amazon, you'll see 5-star reviews for flavor. And that is key, because if you don't love your Fab4 smoothie and you don't love drinking your protein powder, you're not going to do it. It won't become a habit, and it's consistency that outpaces everything. So if you're here and you're listening and you want to give our protein powder a try, use the code PODCAST5 for $5 off your order. And let me know if you love it. My favorite ways to apply this protein powder is in my Fab4 smoothie, making freezer fudge, making chocolate milk, making hot chocolate, and throwing the unflavored into all my kids' baked goods. So let me know how you use it. Let me know if you love it, and share this podcast deal with your friends. Today's guest is Dr. Emeran Mayer. He's a gastroenterologist, a neuroscientist, and an author. At UCLA, he serves as the executive director of the G. Oppenheimer Center for Neurobiology of Stress and Resilience, and the co-director of the Digestive Diseases Research Center. He has spent over 40 years studying the interactions between the brain and the gut and the rest of the body. He is the author of The Mind-Gut Connection and his brand new book, The Gut-Immune Connection, which explores how the brain-gut microbiome system is at the center of many of today's chronic diseases. This episode is so important for our future health. Take a listen and start to implement some of these easy strategies for success and resilience with your microbiome today. Dr. Emeran Mayer, thank you so much for joining me today on the Be Well by Kelly podcast. I have followed your work for quite some time. I'm so excited for the release of your new book, The Gut-Immune Connection, and I'm just so thankful for your time today.
Well, thank you, Kelly, for having me on your show. Greatly appreciate it and look forward to it.
Yes. Well, before we dive deep into the gut's connection with our immune system, our endocrine system, and our nervous system, I would love for you to tell me how you got to where you are today. Why the obsession with microbes and the gut, and how did you find yourself? It's almost like your job is a gastroenterologist and a neuroscientist in the same role. So how does that work?
It is. Well, so I have had a career-long interest in brain-body interactions. That's one of the reasons I went into medical school. And then, debated if I should go into psychiatry or gastroenterology or cardiology. And it seemed at the time from my earliest clinical experiences that patients with chronic gastrointestinal disorders are the best example of these brain or mind-gut interactions. And then I've pursued this for some 30 years without the microbiome. It was really all just the bidirectional communication between the brain and the gut, and that like after 30 years of researching this, it sort of came to a point that we thought we actually knew it all, and then the microbiome came on the scene, and that added. It didn't change the fundamental conceptualization of the mind-gut interactions, but it expanded it, and it all of a sudden expanded it into nutrition, and and then in my new book it goes even further. It goes into where does the nutrition come from? How healthy and how nutrient rich are these plants that we eat, and what role the microbes in the soil play in generating these nutrient-rich plants. So it's been quite a journey, a long obsession with brain-gut communication, and a recent sort of really boost in a direction that I never thought in my career would happen, thanks to the microbiome science.
Absolutely. Well, let's start in your bread and butter work. Let's start in that communication through the nervous system, through the vagus nerve, both branches, to the gut, and from the gut to the brain. Can you explain what the vagus nerve is, how it interacts between the brain and the gut, and what some of your work is showing in regards to that communication?
Yeah, so I would say, there's really the two branches of what's called the autonomic nervous system. So that's the system that regulates essentially all our body functions. It's not our skeletal muscular system, but it's all the organs. And there's two branches. One is the sympathetic, the other one is the parasympathetic. Parasympathetic runs in the vagus. The sympathetic typically is kind of the stress response, so the fight and flight response. And we know a lot about what that system does to the gut. A lot of studies on that. And then there's also, then there's the parasympathetic. The vagus is a big part of that. It's almost like the yin and yang of organ regulations. Sympathetic is sort of the stress part, parasympathetic, the rest part. The vagus nerve is an interesting nerve because 90% of the traffic goes from the gut to the brain. Only 10% goes the other direction. So there's always been this question, why such a extensive highway from the gut to the brain? What is all that information that needs to be encoded? In the meantime, we know these are signals from the immune system of the gut, from the hormonal system of the gut, and now also from the microbiome. All of these systems generate signals that the brain wants to know about. And then the brain adjusts based on its information. It constantly adjusts its output to the body to make sure everything stays in homeostasis. So this is something that we're not aware of. This goes on completely out of our consciousness. But it's the most important regulatory mechanism. It's kind of if you took the computer out of self-driving cars, the car would still look beautiful. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference, but it wouldn't do anything. And it's kind of if you cut off this communication between the regulatory system that the brain provides for all these gut functions. So I should also say, in terms of the traffic from the gut to the brain, a lot of it goes through the vagus, but a lot of it goes also through our circulation, the systemic circulation. So it's always this dual pathway. You have signals in the gut like a satiety signal that acts on the vagus nerve and it sends that signal rapidly to the brain. But the satiety hormones also get into our bloodstream and go slower, take time to get to the brain. And then it's this integration of the vagal part and the systemic part that ultimately creates a signal within the brain. This sounds complicated, but the take-home message is, I would say there's two take-home messages. We have two branches of this autonomic nervous system that fine-tune the function of the gut, and then we have one part of the system, which is the vagus nerve, and it's most important for the signaling from the gut to the brain.
Right. It's communicating with the brain of what's going on inside of our microbiome. What are we eating? What do we have access to? So what are some of the most important messages that are sent from the gut to the brain?
I'm sure we don't know all of those messages yet. This is a science that is still evolving. But at the moment, we can say, if we talk about these gut hormones, so if you put all the hormonal cells in our gut together into one lump, it would be probably our biggest endocrine or hormonal organ. And most of these are related to the systems in the brain that have to do with ingestive behavior. So when do we get hungry, and when are we full, when we should stop eating? So there's a hormone in the stomach called ghrelin That is the only one that stimulates appetite and motivation to seek food. And then there's a series of these hormones in the lower part of the small intestine that contain these satiety hormones. And those are being released. So when nutrients get into the small intestine, they trigger these cells to release hormones that then act on the vagus nerve and get into the bloodstream and the signal to the brain, to the hypothalamus, to turn off your appetite and you feel full. And so that system should work perfectly well to maintain our body weight stable. But a lot of things have happened, and maybe we can get into this later, that have shifted the balance. So this homeostatic regulation by the hormones feeding back to the brain when it's time to stop eating, and the ones that drive the appetite, that's gotten out of balance in our modern world. And so a lot of people eat not for homeostatic reasons, but for hedonic reasons. So for the pleasure to eat, not for the body's needs. And but this hormonal system, is that was one of the earliest systems that has been described in this brain-gut communication, long before anything with the microbiome came up. And there's now, there's now medications that have been tried to kind of simulate some of these satiety hormones to turn off appetite, and that needs to be seen. I mean, so far most of these attempts to antagonize hedonic eating have not been successful with weight loss and sustained weight loss. So I think that's for the most important thing for the hormonal. Now there's another aspect to it which is really interesting, very novel. So the gut and its microbes also have an important role in estrogen regulation, the level of estrogens. So the ovaries synthesize estrogen molecules, estradiol. Apparently that's then metabolized in the liver, excreted through the bile into the small intestine. Not too many people thought about this, what happened. So we just thought that's a way of excreting the estrogen. But we now know that certain microbes have an enzyme that can change the estrogen metabolite into one that can be reabsorbed in the intestine. So if you have these microbes, then they produce a lot of these absorbable estrogen metabolites. They go back into your bloodstream. For example, that's important because so just after menopause, it's definitely one way of having higher levels of estrogen in the system. And if you don't have the microbes, then you have lower levels of estrogen than somebody who has them. Just emphasizing, how important and how crucial the microbes are. What we feed them determines if you have those microbes that do the estrogen metabolism. So also big importance of the gut in terms of female sex hormones in the regulation. And it's something that has sort of just come to the attention recently. It's a fairly new thing.
It's amazing what we're uncovering about the microbiome and its ability to produce byproducts like short-chain fatty acids like butyrate to help us metabolize and excrete certain sex hormones or reabsorb them. I mean, you just talked about ghrelin, which is my favorite. I call it the gorilla hormone. It's just, you're ready, just eat everything in front of you all day long. And calming that, it can be so important for satiety or just not feeling that hunger. But you also touched on an important piece, which is we're just at the tippy top of the iceberg, and you spent 30 years researching this, and now to learn that there's a microbiome and it's influencing all of this. I'd love to, because we're coming off the pandemic, jump into the gut immune connection and talk a little bit about what you learned through your research and what people can do to increase their immunity and take care of themselves through whether that's lifestyle, eating a specific way. What's come out of the research in regards to our gut immune connection, and what's really happening there?
Yes, so this is also similar to what we talked about all the other communication. It's bidirectional. So let me start with the brain that can influence the immune system in the gut. So the same pathways, this autonomic nervous system that regulates gut contractions, secretions. That can also has a big influence on the gut-associated immune system. And a really important point is that about 70% of our immune system is located in the gut. So the architecture is pretty unique. So you have these long gut, and it's different layers. And one layer is called an epithelial layer, that is like the barrier, and then comes the immune layer, and then comes the nervous system layer, and then comes the muscle layer. So it's like a very complex sandwich, with totally different functions in these layers. So any signal that goes from the brain to the gut will affect also the immune system. And for example, stress can up or down regulate the immune system activity in the gut, even without the microbes. But we now also know that some of the signals go through the microbes directly from the brain to the microbes during a stress response, and then that influences the immune system indirectly. And then I should say, so in the opposite direction, again, the vagus nerve has a big importance for this. The vagus nerve has receptors for cytokines, some of these inflammatory mediators. So any inflammatory or immune activation in the gut affects the vagus, and that it signals back to the brain. And there was something probably a decade ago that was sort of demonstrated in mouse models, this concept of the illness behavior. So when you have an immune activation, like with the flu, for example, that you feel tired and you want to sleep all the time, that's thought to involve the signaling from cytokines onto the vagus nerve into the brain. But now you bring the microbes in, and then this design feature becomes even more astonishing. So you have hundreds of trillions of microbes separated from this immune layer in the gut. And that's accomplished by what we call the gut barrier. Has two components. One is a mucus layer, one is a cell layer. The mucus layer is a very effective way of keeping all microbes away from the gut wall. And that mucus layer is heavily dependent on your microbial ecosystem. So there's microbes that play a big role in stimulating the synthesis of mucus from some cells in your gut. There's other microbes or many microbes can actually can eat the mucus and break it down into short-chain fatty acids. So depending on what composition of microbes you have, that determines the thickness and the effectiveness of the mucus layer to isolate the microbes on one side from the immune system on the other side. And then you have the second layer, which is the gut wall, or the epithelial layer. That's really tight as well. It has these tight junctions that link the cells together. But a process can start, and this is sort of one of the hallmarks in the book, and it's, this has sort of been picked up by the lay press years ago, the leaky gut syndrome. That if you have the kind of microbes that no longer can produce an effective mucus layer, then all of a sudden the mucus layer shrinks in its size. All of a sudden the microbes come in closer contact with extensions of the immune system that extend into the gut. That triggers activation of these cells, these dendritic cells. Then these cells produce inflammatory mediators. The inflammatory mediators lead to a loosening of the tight junctions of the cell wall. That is the second barrier. And when that happens, intact microbes or their components can get to the immune system in close proximity. And that obviously then triggers a whole other immune reaction that can be limited to the gut, or more commonly spreads throughout the body. And it's something that's called metabolic endotoxemia. Endotoxemia is basically when you have a severe infection and you can detect pathogens in a blood culture, a very dangerous state. It requires high dose of antibiotics. But with the metabolic endotoxemia, there's no real infection. It's just like you're your own good guys, microbes, now are able to contact the immune cells and trigger this cascade. And this is something quite common in our society, in our developed world, based on the diet that we feed our microbes. So this typical standard American diet, we know leads to an imbalance in microbial composition, which favors this change in the gut permeability, increases the permeability, and leads to this cascade of unhealthy sequences, because that immune activation, once it's systemic, it goes to all the other organs. It goes into your fat tissue. All of a sudden, your fat tissue becomes an immune organ. It goes into your liver, the same thing. It goes into your brain. Probably plays a big role if it's long-lasting and neuroinflammation in the brain and cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease. On the gut level, the same inflammatory pattern probably plays a big role in the development of Parkinson's disease, which starts in the gut, in the nervous system of the gut. And those nerve cells show the same kind of degenerative changes as you find in the brain in Alzheimer's disease. And so it's quite obvious that this immune activation, diet-induced immune activation, plays a role in both, the gut part of Parkinson's and the brain part of Alzheimer's disease.
Wow. It's so powerful to think that your daily choices and your food choices are having that effect, but it makes perfect sense. I mean, we become what we eat. And what I'm curious about, and I'm sure the audience is curious about, is from a patient standpoint, when it comes to understanding if you have microbes passing through your epithelial lining and creating this inflammation, or if you have the start of that leaky gut, are there trusted tests that would allow for patients to understand, yes, I have leaky gut, and if they don't have the microbes that produce this thick mucus layer, what can they start doing to create health in their body?
Yeah, so in terms of the testing, there's lots of these tests, commercial tests available. There's some academic institutions like University of California in San Diego that does this as a crowdsource funding effort to get as much data from as many people as possible. That's fairly inexpensive. But there's a whole industry that has developed in, coming up with these stool tests. And there has been kind of a rapid evolution of the best tests for that. In the beginning, it was just these what's called 16S sequencing. We just get the relative abundances of the main microbes. And we know in research now that's no longer really being used as much as an indicator, because you want to know something about the function of these microbes, what they do, what they produce. And there's a technique called metagenomics or metatranscriptomics, where you actually can get an estimate of what metabolites and what genes are expressed, what metabolites are being generated. There's only, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I'm aware of, there's only one test that does this metatranscriptomics assessment of the microbiome. In my opinion, the most advanced of these tests. And they can give you, they give you a fairly accurate assessment of that. The big question is, and this is where we're still lacking a lot of information, we don't know enough about what these functions do to our gut, to our gut-brain communication, and we don't know how many of these changes actually are predictive of these serious neurodegenerative diseases. And we also don't know accurately what dietary interventions would be required to normalize it if it's abnormal. So a lot of people do these tests and then they come to the physicians, and most physicians are not really trained to interpret those values. The recommendations that many of these commercially available tests give are not based on evidence. They often are associated with recommendations for supplements, not always
Yeah.
The recommendations for the healthiest diet, but the business model is that you sell your supplements, so I'm still, I think in the next 5 years, a few of these tests will be actually much more reliable in their recommendations. And I think they're going to become an essential part of an assessment of your health and your gut health. At the moment, I put this also in my book, that I'm more in favor of an empiric approach, that you say we know what the best diet is for almost everybody, except for people that have a food allergy or a really documented hypersensitivity to a certain food. But all the rest of individuals that look for these tests, my recommendation is, we know what the healthiest diet is for the default diet that we should be on. It's the diet that's best for the microbial diversity. So you have as many different types of microbes in your gut as possible, and which will create then this very rich ecosystem. And this will have two consequences. One is any healthy ecosystem, or the healthier an ecosystem, the more stable it is and the more resilient. So if there's any perturbation from a gastrointestinal infection, food poisoning, antibiotics, it will bounce back much better than if you have a compromised and impoverished, ecosystem in your gut. And the other one is that if you have this diverse system, then it's much better in providing this wide range of beneficial functions that microbes can give us, like just the short chain fatty acids. They have received the most attention, obviously, because they're generally the good guys in all our, in our health issues, both in the gut level and with the immune system. So they're anti-inflammatory. They're nutrients for the cells that line the gut. They act on our satiety, hormone-containing cells in the gut. So most of these functions, they also, when they get into the systemic circulation, have anti-inflammatory effects in the brain. So the richer your microbiome system is, the more of these good guys you produce, and the more beneficial it is for your overall health, not just gut health, but throughout. So how do you accomplish this? It's very simple, something that a lot of people have proposed for a long time: to eat a largely plant-based diet with the greatest variety possible of plants and fruits, and of vegetables and fruits, and that includes the seeds, the nuts, and I come back to in a second to why those parts of the plant-based foods are important. But for the diversity, what you want is a lot of different fiber molecules. So every plant and many fruits have fiber, different types of fiber molecules, probably hundreds, possibly thousands of different molecules. And microbes are specialists, so it's not that one microbe can digest all these different fiber molecules, but you need this community. So one microbe breaks down this fiber, another one breaks down this fiber, and they interact with each other as well. So you need this, this community of microbes, of specialists in breaking down plant-based foods. So, even before you do any tests on your gut microbiome, if you switch to that kind of a diet, you're doing the best that you can. No supplement can really substitute for that kind of a, healthy diet. There are exceptions. So these are people that, often this healthy food is more expensive than the cheap subsidized, animal-based foods. Like you can have a dinner for 4 from McDonald's. That's a lot cheaper than a plant-based dinner from Whole Foods, unfortunately. And so, a big section of our population obviously either doesn't have access or can't afford it. And then there's certain populations where it's harder to get access to it. So the food deserts in downtown areas, people like the Inuits that live, in northern part of the world, that also don't have access to all the same, plants and fruits. Indigenous communities, and again, it's the access. So if you could do something to provide some of these beneficial molecules through supplements to these populations, that's the exception. But in general, if you have access, if you're close enough to a whole food market or farmers markets, even better, then you don't really have to worry about it. What microbes you have in your gut. Science obviously needs to know what goes on in the gut in much greater detail. But for the consumer, I don't think that is really, at this point, essential.
Can we get back to what you were just touching on, which is the leaves, like the plants, the fruits, and the nuts and seeds specifically being beneficial over other plant-based foods?
Yeah, that has to do something with the other big group of molecules or beneficial molecules that are in a plant-based diet. And those are these polyphenols. So polyphenols are these, so they got a lot of attention under a different name as antioxidants, like 10, 15, I don't know how far back that goes. There was even, I think, a recommendation on the FDA website of the highest antioxidant containing foods. And I think that was taken down. There was a sort of a scandal over this because a lot of supplement producers based their recommendation on that website, on these values. In the meantime, and there's always been an issue, this has been the issue from the beginning, if you take these molecules as a supplement, there's very low levels that you can measure in the blood, so what we call bioavailability. And so that's why it's been criticized. Well, if you eat these things, it doesn't get into your blood, so it can't do anything. What people didn't think about for a long time, even till today, you still see commercials, for turmeric. This is the one that creates the highest bioavailability. But what we know in the meantime, that these are very large molecules that cannot be absorbed in the small intestine. Therefore, you don't see the peak in your bloodstream. But they can be broken down and metabolized by microbes, starting in the end of your small intestine and in the large intestine. And what they do there is two things. Like the fiber, they're food for the microbes. Actually, three things. And a second one is that they are beneficial to grow the amount of beneficial microbes, increase the abundance, and suppress the ones that are not as good for you. And the third is once the microbes break them down into these smaller molecules called simple phenols, they are absorbable, and then they get into your systemic circulation. And now a lot of research is going on to determine what the health benefits of these absorbed small components are, which depend on your microbial composition. So one person who doesn't have, the kind of microbes that can break down certain, like this one group called elagitanins. So some people have the microbes that can metabolize them into smaller molecules, and then they create molecules that have been studied that are beneficial for the urological system and for kidney stones. With other people who don't have these microbes, they can't do that. So if you eat a plant-based diet, and you don't know exactly if you have the right microbes that break them down. And it's a general principle. It's the same with the estrogens we talked about. Not everybody has the microbes that can do this, or with bile acids. And that's another reason to have the most diverse microbiome we talked about earlier. It's much more likely that you have the microbes that can do all these things. You want to have the biggest number of factories in your gut that you nurture and feed with your diet, with a very varied diet that can do all these things. But this is something, it's a very new area. People have not really jumped on that to any significant degree. Surprisingly, that even in the scientific literature, there's a minority of articles that talks about this, that you need the microbes to get the benefit from the polyphenols, just to do from the fiber, and now we have the two groups of molecules that are the most health promoting molecules in our diet. And if you optimize, the plant-based component, you will optimize those things. And I've sort of recommended, if you want to do the best for your microbiome, we don't need to do a stool test and then take specific supplements. Just think about what's optimal for your microbes. And if you stick to that, you'll get all the benefits that you can get from them.
It makes perfect sense. If you think about the plants containing all the quote unquote antioxidants or phytochemicals like polyphenols, and including all of the fiber, which I'm so fascinated by as the science grows to understand all the different types of fibers. And as you mentioned, these microbes are specialists. They're specialists in metabolizing estrogen. They're specialists in metabolizing polyphenols and specific fibers. And we really don't know what's going on in each of us because the testing and diagnostic tools haven't really caught up. So what can we do? Eat a bunch of different colorful plants.
Absolutely. And so, you could say that in some ways we don't need all the microbiome science because we already know what's healthiest for us in terms of the diet. On the other hand, we really want to understand this system completely. And because there may be certain things that we do want to know, for example, the diagnostic testing of risk factors, like just with the genetic testing, you go to 23andMe and they tell you have a higher risk to develop Alzheimer's disease. I think that will be sort of a big benefit of that. And we also don't know in terms of the quantities. So with the diet, you don't get these massive doses that you would, let's say if you take 10 supplements a day, each with grams of these molecules. So we don't know if that's good for you or if it's better what comes with nature. A large number of different types of molecules, but not in these high concentrations. Or, for example, if you already have early cognitive decline symptoms, at that point, would it be better to really boost the intake of the polyphenols, of flavonoids? Some studies that suggest that. So the science is really important. But I think for the consumer today, as long as they understand this basic concept, if you want the most diverse and resilient and resistant ecosystem in your gut, and the best, simplest way to do it is through your diet, through a largely plant-based diet.
I love it. And it's so interconnected with our immune system. And as we've come out of this pandemic, we see that, a compromised immune system prior to getting COVID or other chronic lifestyle diseases really impede our ability to have a good outcome. Can we talk a little bit about what lifestyle factors outside of the diet can affect the microbiome and our immune function?
So the entry port for the COVID-19 virus and many viruses is the respiratory system. And, we have these major damages to the lungs in many patients that had the infection. But when you think about it, that 70% of the immune system is located in the gut and travels through the gut and then through the rest of the body. What happens in the gut, first of all, doesn't stay in the gut. It really affects immune responses in other sites of the body. And so there's quite a plausible idea that people that were more susceptible to get infected, particularly to get a more serious form of infection, had to be intubated or developed the post-COVID, the long COVID syndrome, are individuals that something happened in the gut that made their immune system hyperreactive to the virus. And that hyperreactivity, it's called cytokine storm, has been observed in those patients with more severe forms. So from what we talked about earlier, with this close communication of the gut microbiome with the gut immune system, so you had that link, from the diet, the microbes, the immune system reactivity to the kind of immune cells that get to the brain. Not just to the brain, to the lungs in this case, and the damage they do there. So, and it's been shown, there was this observation early on that people in lower socioeconomic populations, lower socioeconomic status populations were more vulnerable, had twice the infection rate and twice the hospitalization rate. And this is also the population that has what's been referred to as comorbidities, which are a number of diseases like hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, metabolic syndrome. So the prevalence of this disease is much higher in those populations. And I made a big case in my book about that's related to the diet, because these populations are on a less advantageous or beneficial diet. So there's this link between, first of all, we know that the microbes influence the immune system, and that influence can then affect the lungs or any other organ. The second one, that we know that the most vulnerable populations for COVID-19 have a immune system, the gut, both the immune system and the microbiome, that creates this hyper-inflammatory state or hyper-responsive immune state. So, this is something, this was certainly not the last epidemic or pandemic that we experienced. And I just hope that, the healthcare system will respond to that by really addressing that question. What can we do to make us more resilient, resistant to these infections? Because a lot of people in affluent parts of the country, even when they got the infections, some prominent politicians, they were boasting, it's not even as bad as a cold. Well, they probably didn't have the same compromised gut microbiome and immune system than people that were more vulnerable to it. And so hopefully that consequence will come out of this. There's still a lot of research going on about the vulnerability factors, but I think we can say for sure that these chronic diseases that I'd like to sort of call the chronic non-infectious disease epidemic, because they have been increasing in our population in parallel with obesity rates, that this is not just bad for a lot of medical conditions, but it's also a big risk factor for future pandemics and who is going to, die from them.
Interesting to think of you talked about it, 70% of the immune system that sits in the gut, that what we're eating can be causing an immune response because our microbes don't have the food that they need to produce the mucus layer to protect the epithelial lining. And then those dendrites are then overreacting and creating this immune response to the food we're eating. That then when we come in contact with something that actually needs our body to fight, we don't have the energy and the strength to do it because our cup is already full of dealing with the food choices that we're making.
Yeah. So if you think we're, maybe 40% of the US population are in this state of this metabolic endotoxemia, or in a chronic state of inflammation that they don't feel, this is not something like, it doesn't feel like having a cold or having any other infection, but it's a smoldering, it's almost like, we just had a big fire here in the canyon where we live. And they, so after they put out the flames, they kept the park closed for several weeks. And we were always wondering why this is. And talking to the firemen, there's this smoldering fire, low-grade fire going on under the surface. And something similar has been observed in the Arctic, where it's not the big fires that we see on television. It's underground spread and persistence of fire. So that's how we have to see that inflammation. It's something that's smoldering without causing symptoms, but constantly, exerting a negative influence on our health. And the longer it persists, the more severe, the consequences will be.
Absolutely. Well, it seems like our food choices are really what's igniting the fire. But our lifestyle choices, our stress, our activity, things of that nature, maybe that might just be a little wind blowing on that fire. And creating
Yeah,
creating a little bit larger flames. So what?
It is a very good way of saying it. So, let's start out with stress. We have this archaic stress response system that every organism has, and that is probably the most important development in evolution, because it saved our species and the species of other animals for hundreds of times. It's what's commonly known under this term fight and flight response, that blood pressure goes up and the heart rate goes up. But this is all pertaining to an acute stressor. And in many developed societies of the world, it's not disappeared completely, unfortunately. That kind of severe acute stressor is not the main problem that we have. It's something that, you get stressed when you drive in the freeway and somebody cuts you out or something, but that goes down, very quickly. It's the chronic stress that this system in our brain is not developed for. It has not been optimized. So it's constantly being activated. It's trying to fight against that chronic persistent stress, and something that's called the allostatic load on our bodies. So the stress system defends your health, or thinks it defends your health, but at the same time, the high cortisol, the high norepinephrine, the high blood pressure is actually counterproductive to your health. So it develops the opposite effect. And it often comes up in conversations with patients that say, if you say something about stress, then a lot of patients say, well, we all have stress, so why do I have these symptoms? Well, first of all, not everybody has the same responsiveness to stress. Something that's kind of develops early on in life, is partly genetic. And not everybody is exposed to that persistent chronic stress, that allostatic load. We know now that kind of chronic stress has a major effect on your gut microbiome. We knew before that it has a major effect on the gut as well. It plays a big role, for example, in diseases like irritable bowel syndrome. But what we know now is that this chronic stress causes a change in the relative abundances. One thing that's been shown, for example, in mice, and that's another amazing example of interconnectedness of things, that you decrease the abundance of a lactobacillus microbe species that it normally produces an enzyme that inhibits, gets kind of complicated, but that inhibits the transformation from tryptophan in our diet to serotonin, or to actually another one, to kynurenine, which is a neurotoxic and unhealthy metabolite of tryptophan. Serotonin is a good metabolite. Kynurenine is a bad one. So in these mouse studies, they found that the chronic stress decreases the population of these lactobacilli, decreased inhibition of that enzyme that transforms tryptophan to kynurenine, increased levels of kynurenine, and then kynurenine acts on the nervous system in negative ways, with neuroinflammation, something called excitotoxicity. So you get excessive release of glutamate. So from something like chronic stress in your brain, interacting with the diet that you eat, generating a biochemical pathway that then ultimately has negative effects on your body. And that's just one example. There's also been shown that chronic stress can decrease the diversity of the microbiome. It's been shown years ago. And it's particularly bad if that happens early on in life, because then the likelihood that this remains permanent is greater. But, we know, for example, during the pandemic, there was the combination of the ongoing stress that we had, that many people had, with dealing with the political situation and economic situation, and then the worry, the daily worry from the news, the rates of infection kept going up. People were worried, am I going to end up in the ICU? So that was a unique situation. We haven't had this for a while, that for a year, people were under chronic, significant stress. And it manifests in increased anxiety, increased depression, increased suicides, but it also has a big effect on the microbiome. and the consequences of that. So that's one. So stress is one of these other factors besides diet. Another one is sleep. So sleep has, so in general, it has many beneficial effects on us. It's a normal diurnal rhythm that everything goes into a sort of a different mode of activity from our waking hours. Certainly the gut changes completely in the way it contracts, and it secretes fluid and acid and bile. And also it changes the microbes, as has been shown. So during the waking and sleeping hours, for example, there's a difference in the way how close the microbes get to the gut layer, the epithelial layer. And if the microbes are closer to this epithelial layer, it stimulates cells in the gut to, not just immune cells, but other cells as well, to express certain genes that then produce molecules that get into the systemic circulation and can affect the liver, for example. So if you have a normal rhythm of your sleep, you also have a normal rhythm of the gut functions that switch every 90 minutes or so. And that translates into a health-promoting interaction between your gut microbes and not just the gut. Again, nothing that happens in the gut stays in the gut. It always spreads to other systems in our bodies. So if you add all the things together, the poor sleep that many people in our society have because of stress, or so many executives boast about only needing 4 hours of sleep. In some ways, that's kind of the worst thing that you can do to microbial community. So yeah, you can do this once or twice, but if you do it on a regular basis, it's not health promoting. And then we have the fourth one, which is the exercise, the physical exercise level. And again, there's studies that have shown that regular daily exercise, aerobic exercise, has a beneficial effect on the diversity and the relative abundance of health promoting microbes in the gut. So this is again like the 4-hour sleep executive. If you think that if you run ultra marathons, that's healthy for you, the bad news is it's not healthy for your gut microbiome. There are studies that have shown it's almost like a severe stressor. So your body and the microbiome perceives this as a severe stressor, development of a leaky gut situation, and the decrease in the abundance of many of the health-promoting microbes. Now, coming back, an early point I made, we sort of know all these things already. We already knew that if you're 50 years old and you practice a healthy lifestyle with daily exercise, moderate exercise, a healthy diet, and good sleep, that can give you up to 10 years of disease-free longevity. So we knew this from these big epidemiological studies, but I think now we're beginning to understand why that is, and what systems in our bodies are responsible of translating these activities, these lifestyle factors, into health and disease.
I love it because you're such a brilliant mind looking at all the research, but we come back to these very simple, doable steps. Eat a variety of vegetables and plant-based foods, variety of fiber and color, move your body, sleep 7 to 9 hours a night, and try to reduce stress. And it doesn't take hundreds of thousands of dollars in superfoods and supplements, but really it is those habitual daily things every day. We didn't get the chance on today's podcast to talk about how our microbiome is much like the soil microbiome, but you were interviewed on one of my favorite documentaries, or on Kiss the Ground's podcast, which Kiss the Ground, that documentary has been one of my favorites and one that I recommend to my audience. It's so important for us to understand that the Earth's microbiome, Mother Earth's microbiome, is just like ours. It's critical for our health. And I just love everything that you're doing. Thank you for spending the time on the podcast today. It was a really fun conversation. And I think a lot of people are going to gain a lot from this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kelly, for giving me this opportunity. I mean, obviously, I became very impassionate. As a scientist, obviously, you need passion, otherwise, you give up many times before. But this has sort of provided a new passion for me to pursue that, and also to take that message to the general population. I don't, at this point in my career, not that interested to teaching my colleagues. I do love to teach students because they are the future, really, but it's much more important to reach these wide audiences, both with the book and with these podcasts, because all the things we need to do today to combat, this chronic non-infectious disease epidemic, we know what it takes to do it. It's just what modalities? Is it through the internet? Is it through courses? Is it to go into schools, teaching young kids, that these are the important things in life? I think that's, to me, equally important to doing the cutting edge science in this area.
Well, your work is what allows us to have the science, to feel so passionate, to get excited about it, to, be able to share your message. So I agree with you that it's our future generations. And so it's where we decide to purchase our proteins and our vegetables. And it's how we vote with our pocketbook, and we really can make change, and we can make change in our families, with our children, and with your students, and with the younger generations. And it's your work that's going to ignite the fire of change and get people excited about it. So thank you so much for writing your new book, The Gut Immune Connection. It's so good. I got an early advance copy. I'm going to throw it up in the show notes and make sure everyone can find you on your website and Twitter. Where can they find you online on social media?
So, I'm on all the social media, but I think the easiest way to find me and all the, the links is through my website, emeranmayer.com. And when you log on, you'll also be asked if you're interested to receive our free newsletter, the biweekly newsletter, and other information that, that I have been telling my patients in the clinic. But if you go to that website, you'll get a lot of information from previous podcasts and, the latest science. So I would say I would encourage everybody to do that. Thanks again, Kelly. It was a pleasure talking to you.
It was really fun. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Be Well by Kelly. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at bewellbykelly.com and follow me on Instagram at bewellbykelly. I would love if you picked up my books, Body Love and Body Love Every Day. They're sold on Amazon and at all major booksellers.